Yeah, of course. This is a beautiful way of this piece of wood meeting a different kind of wood, and the tolerances and the thermal expansion and all of that. All of that stuff is running through my head all the time. But the other thing that runs through my head is thinking about the opening chord of Hard Day's Night, and how the gesture of the Beatles with that opening chord, which has a specific kind of timbre and presence, which rings off the guitars, how that gesture accessed hundreds of millions of people. And it was a shocking texture that was instantaneously recognizable to everyone who heard it once they had heard it once or twice. And that links back to the materiality of the instruments.
I'm very pleased to have Ed Keller as our special guest on this week's episode of Life with Strings Attached. Buckle up, folks, because this is an exhaustive and very impressive bio. One of the longest I've ever had to read, but frankly, I just didn't want to cut anything out. Ed Keller is a designer, professor, writer, musician, and multimedia artist. With Carla Liato, Ed is co-founder of Spec.AE, a speculative design practice, and AUM Studio, an architecture and new media firm with residential projects, competitions, and installations in Europe and the US. They've convened more than 20 international conferences and lecture series. Keller has taught architecture, film media, and technology since 1996. His research and practice explores the structures of feeling which link cultural, infrastructural, ecological, and techno-social systems, revealing emergent terrestrial and cosmopolitical potential. He has spoken on artificial intelligence, architecture, film, technology, and ecology internationally. Current research explores the relationship between philosophy, communication, and sound design and music in lectures, solo performance, and teaching. In 2024, he is a visiting design and history theory faculty at Rensselaer School of Architecture. In 23-24, he was a mentor and curator at Lab 3 Synthetic Minds program with Madrid's Media Lab at the Matadero. In 2022 and 2023, he was a consulting creative director with SingularityNET and a creative director with the Venice Virtual Pavilion 18th Venice Architecture Biennale, a part of which included a symposium that Ed and yours truly co-hosted on the gesture, the icon, and the materiality of sound. Keller has also co-directed the post-planetary universal design program at the New School, served as a creative director at the Italian Pavilion at the 17th Venice Architecture Biennale, and from 2012 to 2020, he was director of the Center for Transformative Media at the New School. From 2009 to 2020, associate professor at Parsons School of Design and associate dean from 2010 to 2012. In a prior arc, he taught advanced architectural design studios, theory, and digital techniques at Columbia University, GSAPP, SciArc, UPenn, Pratt, FIU, and RPI. From 1998 to 2010, his work and writing has appeared in Volume, and, Schism, Evolo, Punctum, Practice, ANU, AD, Arcoin, Leonardo, Electro Almanac, Wired, Metropolis, Assemblage, and Otagono. Ed has also been an avid rock climber for 40 years. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Ed Keller. I hope that you do as much as I did. Ed, great to see you. Thanks for being on Life with Strings Attached.
Jamie, thanks. Great to see you.
Yeah, how are things there in New York?
We're well. We actually just caught the Beat tour a few days ago. I took my son, who's 11 years old, to see that. It's the King Crimson material from the 1980s, as you know, I'm sure. But for your listeners, it's Adrian Belew and Tony Levin playing the material that they recorded back in the 80s. And they're joined by Steve Vai filling in for Robert Fripp and Danny Carey filling in for Bill Bruford. So it was a pretty wonderful show to see and hear. Yeah.
Amazing. And it met expectations.
It did. And I was particularly excited to hear Steve Vai's interpretation of Fripp. There were some extremely intense lines, I think, in Frame by Frame that Steve basically covered with two-hand technique. And it was extremely beautiful. It was fluid. It was virtuosic beyond belief. And very different than Fripp, but it felt just like a great interpretation. So I love the show. And Adrian's playing and singing is just, like stupendous. It's fantastic. His tone, his solos, everything. It's just, it was wonderful. Everybody was wonderful. Yeah.
Amazing. That's, interesting. Maybe I'll check out their tour schedule to see if they've already come through Europe. I'm still in Europe for the next couple of months. So, but we'll see if they've been here or not. Yeah,
you can find a lot of bootleg stuff on YouTube already from their tour. I think they're about 24 dates into a 160 date tour, something like that.
Oh, is that all? Yeah, all right. Fantastic. I mean, those are all very seasoned touring musicians. Those guys work hard, and so that's fantastic. And how was, I don't know if I should use his name, how was your son's reaction to the show?
Our son's name is Sol, and
I know his name. I just wasn't sure whether I should use it or not on the podcast.
He had a great time. I mean, he's seen a number of shows at Jazz in August in Lisbon, and local shows around here. We have some good friends who play in a George Harrison and Beatles kind of tribute band, and they have great musicians. And we've seen their shows live, but this was the first kind of rock show that he saw in his life, and he kept asking me, what's the name of this song? And I was surprised that I could remember pretty much all the songs. And I think he's studying drums, so we were interested in him seeing Danny Carey, of course. And that was great. He's taking lessons with a great drummer who lives very close to us in upstate New York, a guy named Mike Pride. So it's been a great pleasure to get to know Mike a little bit in the past few months, and see Solaris, learn from him. But he had a great time, and it was interesting to listen to some of the King Crimson material with him while we were driving around before we went to see the show, and then to catch the show. So that's fantastic. I don't know that a lot of our listeners know that drums are actually my first instrument. So I play drums actually probably more these days than I play guitar. But drums were my first instrument, followed by bass, then guitar, and singing, and I became proficient in all of them. But I have a serious love of drums, and so that's exciting to me. And Danny Carey is one of those interesting characters because he came to fame because of the band Tool, and to put him in a scenario with Blue and Levin and such, it tells you the depth of his musicianship that I find very often heavy metal musicians are seriously underestimated by the serious musicians of the world. and Danny Carey is a wonderful example of that. Even when Steve Vai really came to fame playing with David Lee Roth, that's another guy, Greg Bissonette, who was playing drums with him, who's also a very serious jazz drummer and just an incredible musician overall who easily moves from one genre to the next. But for whatever reason, not taken so seriously by the intellectual musicians of the world when he's on David Lee Roth's Eat 'Em and Smile, which, by the way, I think is one of the greatest rock albums of all time. But go back and listen to that. I've been listening to a lot of Bruford in the past, more than the past year, actually. I just keep going back to old Bruford before King Crimson, and but I agree with you about Danny Carey. I think he's a tremendous diverse musician. It was really interesting to hear him in the King Crimson context. And then there were these moments where, of course, he and Steve Vai, they kind of shined with their full personalities. Steve on some of the solos he took, where he could branch out from, playing the Fripp parts. And then Danny, there were a couple of moments, I think it was on the end of Indiscipline, where he just was raging. And it was, it sounded like Danny from Tool, and it was fantastic to hear that in that context. But it didn't feel displaced or out of whack with the kind of King Crimson strength. Yeah, they did a cover of Red at the very end, and it was just tremendous. I also love Tool as a band, and I was very impressed with how they reached an extremely wide audience doing the kind of music that they do, which is very complex and addresses a kind of level of subconscious and trance and drone, I think, in the audience that you usually don't find reaching a mainstream audience. Maybe in drone metal, if you're thinking about, I don't know, Earth or Sono or someone like that, there's a niche audience, but Tool reached a mainstream audience.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about this before a number of times, Jamie, the question of what it means to reach a planetary audience. I think Tool, maybe they weren't as big as the Beatles. Remember what the Beatles said about themselves, but they certainly have reached a massive audience. And I still am a little bit mystified by that, because Tool's music is extremely complex and challenging. What do you think enabled them to reach a wider audience the way that they did?
A great question that I'm not sure I have a very good answer for, because I'm often surprised at what it is that attracts people to music. And, this came up in a recent discussion where, rock and roll was birthed in America, but it became rock in the UK, where old world music was injected into rock and roll, where different modes and movements. There was a more complex music came back through Led Zeppelin and even bands like Black Sabbath and Genesis, of course, the Police, this whole part of the late 60s, early 70s. And, some of those bands did extremely complex things and yet reached pop sensibilities. And there's bands who give very simple offerings who never do. And so complexity, not complexity, I'm not sure how it adds to the equation, frankly, Ed. You look at a band like AC/DC who played basically the same song, and we love the 100 versions of the same song that they produced for 50 years. And they make no bones about it. They tell you straight up, we've been recording the same song for 50 years, and with slight variations on it. And we still love them for it. And then there are other bands who are much more complex, who musicians will say, oh, they've never gotten their proper recognition. And then there's bands like Tool that slip through and do it. They do get the recognition, but I don't know that I can put my finger on why. Do you have a reason?
I think about the way that Eno worked with Bowie and then with U2. I think that was Daniel Lanois's work, the Flood. That there was a production attention there that brought a lot of complexity in. Eno is just kind of towering figure for me, going back to not just Roxy Music, but his own production, Another Green World, and discrete music, all of that, very, very important for my formation when I was coming up in the 80s. And I feel like that might have prepared a wider audience. Obviously, Bowie, working with Blue, working with Fripp, that prepared a wider audience for some of the sensibilities that they were exploring in pre-Crimson, and then Crimson. Fripp, of course, his sensibilities coming out of albums like Islands. I feel there's an overlap in some of his chord solo stuff in Islands, which is a less listened to King Crimson record for many people, but I love it. And some of the work that he did with Bowie. So there's that connection, that made a popular audience able to listen to and hear something broader. Obviously, U2 did a lot of work to open up that listening space. Maybe there were metal bands, maybe the metal culture, Metallica, etc., made it possible for people to hear Tool in a broader sense, even though Tool's doing something much more complex, right?
Ironically, Metallica had to simplify to get the pop audience. Because it wasn't until their production with Bob Rock who made them basically, they said, stop having 13 different riffs within your songs. They used to have these very long intros, and effectively you could cut each one of their earlier songs probably into 3 or 4 different songs if you wanted to. And that's what Bob Rock did to them with their Black Album and Enter Sandman, which of course was their huge breakthrough, and Nothing Else Matters and those things. Is he actually, I mean, some people would say dumb them down. He simplified what they were doing. But that's possible that it still did make a gateway for someone like Tool to then later on give them more complex music, as people expanded through it. It's this variation, this crossing of genres, these musicians who have a much more breadth to them than we realize. We try and always see the world in the most useful sort of low resolution version of it. We put people into little boxes, and if we stay on the King Crimson theme for a second, I've had a chance to interact with Tony Levin, probably a very long time ago now. I was at a Bass Player Live in New York, and I had an art gallery at the time that showed guitar as sculptural art. And I had heard that a few of the bass players there, Leland Sklar and Tony Levin, actually went to school for fine art, and their music took off, and they ended up with a music career. But Levin, I don't know if you know this, Tony Levin has been, at least he was at the time, and had been for decades, had been setting up cameras at live shows on triggers. Some of those things down there that look like pedals aren't pedals. He's firing off cameras during the show, or at least that's how he did it at one point. When I saw him so long ago at Bass Player Live, probably around 2005 or 6, 7, somewhere around there. And he has this incredible catalog of live photos from side stage and backstage.
Yes.
Towards the audience. You knew this. Yeah. And he also has this, he had this horrendous fire which burnt down his practice shed, where a lot of his iconic instruments got burnt, but he photographed them and he kept them still in the burnt state. Again, my information is, 10 or 15 years old at this point in time, but he had kept them at that point in time and always thought he would return to doing more fine art. Leland Sklar was the same way. He was trained as a sculptor and a fine artist and always thought he would go back to doing fine art, and he expressed to me at the time that he was surprised he was still relevant and getting hired at his age. But of course, both of them are incredible musicians, and still continue to be relevant. But, it's that other side that I wanted to sort of say, and it's that other side, that diversity of character and interests and curiosity that led me to first meeting you, because I was looking to explore other creative disciplines at the point where they might intersect with the guitar. And there was this guy who I kept hearing about who had invited Michihiro Matsuda and Ola Strandberg. And I think, although I don't think it ever happened, Uli Teufel, I think, told me you reached out to him, and Michael Spalt. And so our worlds were touching a little bit. And I thought, well, this sounds like an interesting person that I'd like to get to know and see if there's any synergies, and that's exactly how we met. I literally just reached out to you and said, "Hey, I don't know if you know what I do or who I am, but I'm interested in the things you're doing. Would love to talk." And here we are. I don't know how many years later now, but
it feels like it's like 7 or 8 years later now. I think.
Yeah, I think it must be.
I was trying to set up a larger guitar show based out of the New School, the University of New York, where I was teaching and running a center. And we had done the Limits of Guitar and the Future of Guitar series from about 2013 to 2019. So I think you and I must have met around 2017, maybe. We were kind of deep into that series. We had a lot of amazing players come and play also over the years when we had Ken Parker come and show his archtop guitars. Charlie Hunter came and played those, and Gian Riley played one of Florian Verreiter's experimental 8-string lute fusion guitars. Elliot Sharp played Mitchie's early, I think it was one of his very first experimental archtop, kind of minimalist sculpture guitars. That was a really good project for about 7 years, 6 or 7 years. It came about in an interesting way because I had just taken over directing a center at the New School, and one of my deans at the time, Miodrag Mitrosinovic, and I were talking. He knew that I was a guitarist and a composer originally, and he said, "Why don't you do something that looks at guitar building and guitar design?" And I thought, this is a wonderful idea. Let's just give it a go. Let's do an event this fall. I think it was the fall of 2013, and see how it runs. So I invited a few people who I imagined I would never be able to get to come. Ed Steinberger,
Yeah.
and Ken Parker. And Ola Strandberg, I had just become familiar with his guitar, so I invited Ola, and we invited Gary Lee, who's an amazing classical guitar builder based in, I think he's in New Jersey right now. Everybody said yes, and they all came. And then we had amazing players come and play their instruments during the events that we held. The event with Ken was particularly amazing because we hosted it at Venice School of Music, and Ken got 5 or 6 people who own his archtops to bring them to the event. And there was this one moment where several of Ken's incredibly valuable archtops were literally being passed hand to hand through the audience for people to inspect and check out and play. And then there was a little jam session afterwards where many people were playing these archtops that had been brought by their owners. So it was very special. It was really, really cool event. And that took off. I mean, at that point, we realized that we could do this in an interesting way. We hosted those workshops with Michi Matsuda. He came several times, and there was one point where he came for about 4 days and did a joint workshop with Florian Verreiter that involved testing and playing the instruments, guitar students from Venice School of Music, and the jazz program at the new school, and doing hands-on guitar building workshops in the shop at Parsons School of Design. So it was really special. It was a really good run. It also, you mentioned that Levin's background overlapping with photography and fine arts is an important part of his practice. And I feel, that applies obviously with folks like Eno and the Talking Heads as well, who see sound from an almost synesthetic perspective. I just want to say one thing about Levin. His work is so important to me also through his collaboration with Peter Gabriel. And to me, it feels very much on some of the most important Peter Gabriel tracks, the most popularly important as well as the most beautiful for me, that it's really a duet between Levin's bass sound and Gabriel's voice, which isn't to diminish everyone else who's amazing as a musician around Peter Gabriel, but sometimes the fingerprint of his most important songs for me is his voice with Tony Levin's bass sound.
Sure. Don't Give Up is a great example of that. I think that's the name of the song, isn't it? That's the repeated line anyways, and Steam, Levin's driving Steam for sure,
But the question of the interdisciplinary overlap is super important. The colleague I mentioned at the New School, Miodrag Mitrosinovic, he was originally a rock guitarist who came out of kind of a rock band culture in Croatia, and became an architect, came to the States, continued teaching architecture, but then became a leader of a transdisciplinary design program at Parsons. And the goal of that program, which was founded by Joel Towers, who's now the president at the New School, but was the executive dean at Parsons, and Miodrag and a number of other faculty at Parsons and the New School, was to specifically incubate the kinds of things that we ended up doing with the Future of Guitar and the Limits of Guitar program, and the collaboration between Parsons, New School students and faculty, and Manus and jazz faculty and players. Yeah.
Wonderful. It's it's interesting because that when I bring up the New School, and for those of our audience who don't quite know what that is, let me tell you this. I once spoke to a design school professor in New Zealand, and I asked him if he knew of the New School. And he said, yeah, the New School is the school that we all hope we will be. And so that tells you the regard for the New School around the world. That someone on the other side of the world is saying that's the school we're aiming for. That's the kind of level where. And Ed, you spent many years there at the New School.
Yeah, a decade full time, and then more than 20 years over a period.
Yeah. And one of the famous moments of all of our lives in living memory, of course, was the pandemic. And I have yet to be at the New School because you and I were going to meet up there, and I was leaving the coffee shop. I met with Gordon French from Rudy's Music, and we had coffee down there in New York. And on my way to get the car to drive to the New School, I got a message. Hold on. They just called us into a meeting. Yale or someone else had just announced closures, and
Yeah.
yeah, the rest is history. I didn't make it to the new school. The schools got shut down, all of that, and years ago. And but I'm certainly glad that you did those things there, because it's what called you to my attention. And now I've learned so much more about what you're doing. Ed, you're really doing incredible work across so many disciplines. And I think, I refer to myself these days as professionally curious, and I think you certainly fall into that category as well. And would you mind sort of telling us what you've been up to lately? Just giving us an update as where you're currently at, and what's the most interesting thing for you to be doing these days, and take it from there.
Sure. Well, I'm trained as a composer and a guitarist when I was a kid. And then after a number of years of sort of drifting and being a rock climber and trying to be a guitarist on and off, I discovered architecture. So I studied architecture in graduate school. I became a professor. I've taught at many universities, Columbia, SciArc, UPenn, Parsons, Pratt, Rensselaer. I'm teaching at Rensselaer currently, and that was actually my first gig back in the mid '90s, teaching at Rensselaer Polytechnic. So I've always been looking for a bridge between one practice and the other. Sometimes it was driven by a clear goal, and sometimes it was simply professional curiosity, as you put it. I've always been really, really interested in finding overlaps. Many people I knew in college built their own guitars. So I built some electric guitars when I was a kid, and was always looking for the overlaps between a kind of a material understanding, a deep material knowledge, and something else, a gesture, a sound, a physical experience, a community experience, a common experience. Yeah. So I taught architecture for many years, and right now I'm teaching architecture, but I've been doing a lot of research with generative AI. And part of this has been connected to an on-off consulting gig that I've done with SingularityNET at the invitation of Ben Goertzel and his team, which has been great since about 2021. Part of the work that I've been doing has been curatorial. I did some curatorial and creative director work with the Venice Biennale, the Italian Virtual Pavilion Architecture Biennale a few years ago, and then CityX Venice a year and a half ago. And that has been driven by a set of questions around what it means to constitute design thinking at the planetary scale. I came up with a little title, a catchphrase, which was intended to capture people's attention: post-planetary design, back in 2012. And I taught about an 8-year run of seminars and conferences, which I ran on post-planetary design at Parsons. The goal of this was really to look at science fiction and science and philosophy and design thinking to try to understand what it would mean to think design at the scale of the planet, for the betterment of all, of humanity, of ecosystems as well. I was thinking very holistically. I've been very influenced over the recent years, revisiting Aldo Leopold's deep land ethics and deep ecology thinking in his book, Sand County Almanac. And so those kinds of bridges between kind of cradle to cradle design thinking and the ecologies of design, not just the life systems ecologies, but the economics and ecologies of design, doing design from first principles. So that's been informing some of the work in the past 2 or 3 years. And of course, the pandemic took the wind out of a number of sails and made it quite difficult. My partner and wife, Carla, continued teaching online during the pandemic. I continued doing consulting. We co-directed a program called Post-Planetary Universal Design for about 2.5 years with an organization called the New Center, which is a wonderful online school and kind of research center that has programs in something like planetary design, curation, philosophy, and transdisciplinary design. It brings a range of wonderful philosophers in to direct their programs and teach, people like Cecil Malaspina, Reza Negarestani, Dejan Lucic, many, Benjamin Bratton, Juliet Aranda, Nandita Biswas-Malamfi. These are all people who operate in the tech theory, media theory, philosophy, cultural criticism space, and they're all really renowned thinkers and writers, professors. So that was a great opportunity to try to establish a position over a decade, going from the work that I had done at Parsons on post-planetary design and the conferences that we hosted out of CTM. We hosted maybe 25 international conferences over a 7-year period, to thinking in the space of music, what would it mean to do design at the planetary scale? And obviously, and this dovetails into what we were talking about a few minutes ago when we were thinking about Tool and what made it possible for Tool to be a very large success on a popular level. This dovetails back into the kind of media theory space to ask the question, what social cultural configurations are actually necessary for a musical genre like and an act like Tool, a band like Tool, to not only take off but to reach millions and millions of ears. And so this is part of the research that I've been doing in the past 7 years or so, very recently working with generative AI and mostly image generation tools. Even though as a musician, I've played around a little bit with the generative AI sound tools, I'm more interested in the image and spatial generation. Although I do see the sound generation tools taking off rapidly, and I think that the sea change for musicians is going to be dramatic and in many cases dreadful in the next 3 to 5 years. But I see there being a kind of there's a pivot point taking place at a planetary scale right now because of generative AI, because of large language models and tools like ChatGPT, Claude, Google's toolset, Gemini, etc. Not only will many jobs be eliminated and replaced by artificial tools, artificial intelligences, but the way that we understand the production of cultural content will profoundly shift. I think already we're at a moment where a large body of content that's produced on our planet is produced by machine learning and AI systems interacting with human-produced content, modifying it, and then sending it back out into the world. Sometimes to be viewed, listened to, and consumed by humans, but sometimes to be observed by other machine learning systems. And it's very much a snake eating its own tail system. So the real urgent design problem that we see right now, that my partner Carlo Leitao, many of the people that I work with, the urgent challenge that we see is how to position the human in the loop, on the loop, and outside of the loop in the next 5 to 7 years as generative AI really takes off, as companies like Microsoft literally reboot 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant to run their systems. You know, this is something which seems almost like a science fiction headline, but you see large-scale organizations like Microsoft realizing that to run the server systems and the AI backend infrastructure, they will need so much power that they literally need to reboot nuclear power plants or build new nuclear power plants. This is absolutely a reality. And so we're at a fascinating pivot point, I think, in human history, which will have a range of consequences that we as futurologists and science fiction readers and writers have been thinking about and dreaming about for decades. But this is the question that we're focusing most of our energy on. And, you know, for me, it's been a really fun 3 years because I get the opportunity to work with folks like you and work with folks like Ben Gertzel at SingularityNET, Gabe Montes at SingularityNET, who you did an interview with a few months ago. Really brilliant people who are looking at the sort of cutting edge overlaps between neuroscience, philosophy, computer science, language, cognition, and artificial intelligence. You know, it's just a fascinating, amazing set of overlaps. Also, on a personal note, for me, working with generative AI has been an amazing experience because every day when I make images like the one that's sort of floating behind me here, I get to explore the possible pasts, possible presents, and possible futures of architecture, photography, art, spatial design, material science, furniture, musical instrument design, everything. And it's been a really immersive kind of addictive experience working with AI because of the incredible creative potential that it does open up, even while it, destabilizes all of these disciplines. So that's a kind of a attempt to summarize in 5 minutes, where I came from.
Very well put.
Moment.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. And let's dive into that last little bit, because honestly, it's been a recurring theme, and many people are distracted by the negative side of it, and maybe I'm just too tragically optimistic, but they're very concerned about what we will lose. The thing that keeps getting my attention, and when I look at the image behind you, it gets my attention again, is that in order to train these computers, the learning systems, we're learning so much about ourselves because it's only doing exactly what we asked it to do. And you realize the incredible inefficiencies of our language, how much we insinuate. I'm sitting here in Italy right now, and I'm trying to communicate with the agent of the place we're in, and sometimes I get a translation. I'm like, that makes no sense. It's word for word exactly what it was, but I'm like, I don't know what this means, because there's some sort of cultural story embedded into the terminology he used, which every Italian understands, that is missed on me when it gets translated directly into English. And likewise, when we go back, we've all had those moments where we had to explain a part of our culture to someone else. We were once doing an event in London on Guy Fawkes Night, and the event organizer was trying to explain to us, well, Guy Fawkes Night, he tried to burn down the Parliament, and then we make a stuffed man and then we burn him. Oh my God, we sound psychotic. Like he was a very normal thing. All the children, everyone knows what Guy Fawkes Night is in London, but it sounds insane to us here, in North America anyways. And so anyways, this idea that communication, the language set we're using, as our world sort of becomes closer and closer together, how we communicate effectively across multiple languages. One of the neat little facts about the massive country of India is that there are so many individual indigenous languages in India that English is the common language amongst Indians. It's like, what? Yeah, because ultimately, although we're attached to our languages, ultimately we need to be able to effectively communicate to each other so that we can buy that piece of cheese in the in the end, a simple way. And so let me bring this back to where we'd like to go with this is, when you say you're excited every day by dealing with these images and making these images and dealing with both the future possibilities and past sort of possibilities within architecture and design in a visual format, you must be learning a lot about yourself, about our culture, about how we communicate things. And are you dialing in your language? You must be dialing in your language set. Is that a big part of the conversation with everyone? The prompts themselves, the prompt engineering is a huge part of this. But that's forward into the computer. When we say prompt engineering, we're thinking about forward into the computer. I'm more interested in, what you must have experienced for years as a professor and as a teacher. Anyone who's ever taught knows that you learn so much about yourself through the process of teaching. Being a parent, when you raise children, you learn so much about yourself. You're like, oh, that little shit, oh my God, they're just like me. I got to stop doing that, and you learn. So would you mind reflecting on that for a moment about the lessons? And are you very conscious of how it's changing your perspective on the world as a human, and not just how we're affecting change on the computer side?
There are a lot of ways to address this. One is to talk about the language and communication aspect and gesture. And there's a project that Carla Leitao, my partner and my better half, and I worked on back in 2005. We were invited to do an installation at SciArc, where I was teaching at the time, Southern California Institute of Architecture. And a couple of years later, I directed a program there called Mediascapes for a few years, post-grad program. The project we did was called Suture. And we were interested in, from film theory, Kaja Silverman's notion of suture. Now, what she says is basically, when we see a movie, you can have a jump cut that goes from one place in space to another place in space, or one moment in time to another moment in time. And you stitch it together, you suture it together, because the way that our brains are wired to construct narrative, and a visual narrative and a spatial narrative and a sonic narrative, we glue stuff together that would make no sense if you think about it objectively, for us to be able to make sense out of it. And so she was very interested in the phenomenon of suturing in film, but we said, well, what if we take this and we mix film, documentary video with landscape? And we say that infrastructure and landscape and human gesture can all be sutured together. So instead of it being a narrative where you jump from one point in time to another in the timeline of a film edit, and I'm super impressed with Walter Murch's, astounded by his body of work, both as an editor and a sound designer. We looked really closely at Walter Murch's work when we were doing this project, and we always have adored his work. He worked with Coppola. He worked on Apocalypse Now and The Conversation, The English Patient with Anthony Minghella, etc. For those who won't know Walter Murch's name. So what we tried to do with our suture project is I shot dozens of hours of documentary video footage as I traveled around the country, because I was always on a plane back in those days. So I was between LA, Miami, Philadelphia, New York, back and forth. And so I just carried a camera with me. I was really into the film Memento at the time too. So I had my little camera slung underneath my jacket, and I would pull it out and I would shoot video. And, I love Wim Wenders. So I was always thinking about filmmakers who were very focused on the mechanism of the apparatus of filmmaking. So I shot documentary footage for a couple of months, and we put together an installation with multiple screens and a sound environment in the installation room, where as you walked around the room using Max MSP as a kind of a back end for the system, if you hit pressure sensors in the floor, you would trigger remixes of the films. And what we did is we cataloged the film footage to say there's close-up, medium shot, and long shot, and there's homogeneous materials, aggregate materials, or neutral materials. And so we had a huge database of video footage that I had shot, but we also sampled from very specific films that we loved, like Amateur by Hal Hartley, or Afterlife by Koreeda, or Vertigo by Hitchcock. And we only took human gestures from the films that were made by the filmmakers we loved. But we only took infrastructure, cities, architecture, and landscape from the documentary footage that I shot. And we merged those together so that as you walked around this environment, there's a very immersive, synthesized audio landscape that merged the footage from the films with audio synthesized by a Native Instruments synthesizer package called Metaphysical Function, really beautiful spatialized sound environment. You would trigger a remix of the film footage that we had shot. And we were very interested in taking, again, Kaja Silverman's idea of suture, but instead of applying it to narrative, applying it to architecture, landscape, urbanism, and gesture. Now, your mileage may vary. If you see footage of our installation and our project, you may like it or you may not. But the point of that project was very specifically to investigate the problem of communication and to hypothesize that architecture and the built landscape of the city are part of a broader communication matrix, which we all live within. And we all perceive in a greater or lesser state of attention. Walter Benjamin famously said, we walk around our world perceiving it in a state of absent-minded examination. And we were very interested in trying to highlight that and reveal some of the implicit linkages of gesture and space that people live in but don't usually notice. And the goal of this project, in part, was driven in a very funny way by our encounter with the writing of Giorgio Agamben, philosopher, religious historian and theorist. He wrote a very beautiful short essay called Notes on Gesture. And in it, Agamben makes this hypothesis. He basically says, gesture is a form of lossy communication information lossy communication. Now, you know what this means. Basically, it
No,
means
I don't. Explain. What is lossy?
okay, if I send a message to you and you receive the message and you decode it 100% accurately, that's lossless communication.
Yes.
If I
Yes.
have a
Okay.
sound file and I compress it using Apple's lossless codecs,
Yes.
compression
Yes.
decompression algorithms, then I get back all the information I put in, supposedly. If I use an MPEG compression, a really crummy MPEG compression, then I lose some information and I have to reconstitute it. If I tell you a story and you tell the story to your son and your son tells the story to his partner and it gets back to me, telephone game. It might be a different story by the time it gets back to me. And so what Agamben said basically in his writing on gesture was, the gesture is something where in a culture you may do something like this in Italy and it may mean one thing, but it may mean something else to another culture in India or in Japan. And Agamben says that isn't a bad thing. Agamben basically says the core of being human is when someone makes a gesture towards you and you don't fully understand it, so you lean forward to enter into a dialogue with them. And then they hopefully lean forward again on their side. It's like the Marshall McLuhan, cold media, warm media, hot media. If it's cold, it's asking you to lean forward to try to figure out what the media is saying. But if it's hot, it's telling you lean back because I'm coming at you. I'm coming at you with all of this flow of really intense information. And so we were very interested in that idea, but looking for gesture in the cityscape, looking for gesture in an architectural detail, looking for gesture in a road out in the middle of the desert, very close to the Mexican border near the Salton Sea.
Give an example of that. Give an example of what a gesture looks like in architecture for the folks who haven't thought much about architecture.
Well, there are a lot of ways of looking at this. One is a famous study from the 1950s, which looked at the optimization of kitchens. So if you have a person in a kitchen, and they were thinking about housewives then, unfortunately, but I love cooking, you love cooking, we all love cooking today. So the gesture in the kitchen would be anyone who's in the kitchen cooking, and they were trying to imagine how to optimize kitchen efficiency. So the gesture would be how many movements you have to make to get from the sink to the cutting board to the stove back to the sink. And they were looking at ways of optimizing that in relationship to the dimension of a human body. How long is a human arm? How many steps do you have to take? Yada, yada, yada. They had a predefined notion of efficiency. I don't particularly agree with that idea of efficiency, but it was a very interesting way of trying to imagine optimization. Another form of gesture in architecture, to jump scales dramatically, would be the gesture of the church built by Giovanni Michelucci in the town of Longarone. Now, Jamie, I know you know this building because you visited it with Di Donato some months ago.
Yes, because you told me about it.
And you and I have talked about this building. So the story behind this building is very sad. The village was destroyed when a huge landslide forced a tsunami of water over a dam up in the mountains above the village and wiped out the village. And the architect Michelucci was commissioned to design the church to replace their church as the village rebuilt. Michelucci's church looks like a vortex of concrete. It looks like a flow of water. It looks like a flood captured and frozen in architecture. And the striking moment in this building is there's an interior space of worship in the church, which is underneath a concrete structure that's suspended above you. And if you go on the roof of the building, there's an amphitheater on the roof of the building, which is also a space of contemplation and gathering and worship. And in the wall of the amphitheater on the roof of the building, there's a gap. And if you sit there and you look through that gap, you see the dam in the distance where the flood came from that destroyed the village. Now, what Michelucci was doing was making a gesture with that building, which would capture the horrible event that happened that destroyed the village and killed thousands of people. It would install a memory for future generations of that event, very much like a memorial. It would also give them the opportunity to reflect across that huge space, many miles to the mountains in the distance where you can see the gap. And it would make a reference, in my opinion, to something like the biblical flood. So there's a cultural narrative and a religious narrative there, and a series of events. And it would make a reference to the deeper archetypal eternal floods that take place on planets and across solar systems and across galaxies and across our universe. And so I think Michelucci was effectively creating a masterwork of gesture in the church at Longarone to incorporate all of those different scales of event, to build a kind of a group memory in people, to tap into an archetypal memory in people.
Yeah.
So that's an example of architecture, masterpiece architecture, in my opinion.
Yes.
Capturing a kind of a gesture across many scales, from what it means to sit down, just to sit down in a church and contemplate and listen and feel, to perceive landscape across many miles, to then invoke an event which mirrors another event at a different scale, all of which fold us as human bodies into those events. So that's my description of one way of architecture accessing multiple scales of gesture.
Yeah, and you describe it so well, Ed. And there's so much more. Because much of our audience is guitar makers, I thought I'll expound upon that just a little bit, because this is shaped as a vortex and it's poured concrete. However, he brought in shipwrights to make it. And so you can see the board relief in all of this. And so this is both the flood and the ark, because of course the church, which is the place of being saved. And the ark is how Noah and the animals were saved from the terrible disaster as well. And so there's so much imagery. And one of the things I really love about this very modern context is that many of the idols, can I call them idols? The crucifix, the statue of the Virgin Mary and Babe, all of these things were washed down the mountain pass in this terrible flood.
Yes.
And they were found many miles away and brought back. What's so fascinating is they didn't restore them. And so the crucifix, the Virgin Mary, and such antiquities, that they left the evidence of the flood damage, the paint scraped off them, the water logging, everything on them, and put them back in the concrete modern structure of this church. And so there's so much interesting narrative going on there. And so I think that's really fascinating. Ed, how do you then take that and synthesize it and lay it over top of guitar design? You've thought a lot about guitar design as well. And of course, a large part of our audience are guitar makers. And so how do you take that thinking of gesture and what you're informed with in design and architecture, and then put it onto a much smaller object like a guitar?
Yeah, so I built a few electric guitars when I was a kid. I am not a builder myself, although having spent so much time with the amazing builders that I've been honored to meet, that you know very well, Jamie, I've thought about guitar design a lot. And as an architect, of course, I wake up at 2 a.m. and I think about designing things. And so, or I'm singing to my young daughter when she was just a baby, and I'm thinking as she falls asleep, the neck detail on that guitar, how could that be changed? I mean, so these kinds of things, we architects, when we have insomniac moments, that's what we think about. We think about details and fitting things together. And because I spent so much time with geniuses like Michi Matsuda, I started buying books on Japanese joinery. And then I would wake up at 3 a.m. and 2 a.m. and I think, that joint, my God, what if you built a guitar using that joint? I bet Michi knows that joint. That's got to be the way he's thinking about fitting that neck together. I love that glue, So that's one way that, for me, it all hangs together. And it's a very traditional, classic way of thinking. Of course, this is a beautiful way of this piece of wood meeting a different kind of wood, and the tolerances and the thermal expansion and all of that. All of that stuff is running through my head all the time. But the other thing that runs through my head is thinking about the opening chord of Hard Day's Night, and how the gesture of the Beatles with that opening chord, which has a specific kind of timbre and presence, which rings off the guitars, how that gesture accessed hundreds of millions of people. And it was a shocking texture that was instantaneously recognizable to everyone who heard it once they had heard it once or twice. And that links back to the materiality of the instruments. And that gesture also links to the way that the human body interacts with it. One project that I've wanted to do for more than a decade now that we haven't gotten around to doing would be to gesture capture musicians playing instruments, to get Wendy Eisenberg or Sandy Ewan or Charlie Hunter or Elliott Sharp and spend a week with them doing gesture capture of every scale of their body as they play their instruments. Sandy plays her guitar sometimes with a railroad spike. A railroad spike that has got to weigh 2 or 3 pounds. It's solid metal. She uses it almost like a slide. It transmits energy to the strings. She's playing like a semi-hollow electric guitar, completely standard electric guitar, and the sound she gets out of it by touching it with a railroad spike is otherworldly. It's vast. You can feel this incredible inertia and momentum of the heavy metal touching the strings. It's fantastic. I mean, it goes to a different place than slide guitar usually goes. And so Sandy's work is just fantastic for me. And one of the best guitar performances I've ever seen was Sandy playing at one of the events that we put together back in 2019. And that kind of approach of gesture through material to the instrument, knowing that there's a direct channel to the sound and the production of sound, that gesture is what we're interested in. So again, we haven't done this project. I would love to do it, but I'm particularly interested in the idea that there would be a set of what you can call ultra-conserved gestures. What do I mean by that? So ultra-conserved words are words that have existed for thousands of years across multiple cultures. And linguistic researchers have said there might be ultra-conserved words like mother or fire or ashes or we or I or you that have had the same rough sound and the exact same meaning for tens of thousands of years. So it's very possible that when people were in the Chauvet Caves 25,000 years ago, they might have had a limited vocabulary where they could say mom, mother, I, you, fire. Yeah? That's an ultra-conserved word. Now, an ultra-conserved gesture would be a gesture that we have used for tens of thousands of years. For tens of thousands of years, humans have been playing simple flutes made out of bird wing bones. And we've discovered pentatonic scales and harmonic overtone series. So for tens of thousands of years, we've been making those same sounds. And that idea of gesture as a form of, pre-linguistic or proto-linguistic communication is especially important. And this is where there's a connection between the kind of preoccupations that we have as architects, myself, Carla, all of my architect colleagues, and what the guitar builders who are listening to this and hopefully are still with us and enjoying it, the vocabulary of material study and sonic study that the guitar builders are focusing on. To me, there's a kind of an overlap there. I'm very interested, of course, in the idea of the ultra-conserved gesture because we could start making some conclusions about gestures, the essential nature of gestures for humans. If we can start to map those, what movement have human bodies made for 30,000 years in relationship to a vibrating string that turns it from simply the discovery of a cool sound that you can make when you pluck a gut string that you never knew 30,000 years ago could be made to something that can turn into the opening chords of that Beatles song, right? So hopefully this unpacks a little bit the overlaps between an unconventional architect's approach to guitar design and the production of sound through guitars, the making of guitars using specific materials, and these kinds of ideas of gesture.
I think that you're a wonderful abstractor and a very gifted synthesist. Can I call you that? I think your ability to synthesize one concept upon the other is very, very high. If we measured that in some way, I'm sure someone does. On a more simple term, there is something that attracts architects to guitars. And when I'm on tour with the Boutique Guitar Showcase, I'm conscious of architects. I'm like, oh, an architect's going to buy that guitar. I'm going to be talking with engineers and architects about this guitar. I'm sure of it. Where we go, and engineers and architects are not the same, but they have obviously some similar ways of thinking. And do you have any idea why that is? Are there other common areas of interest amongst architects, that maybe would help us understand what the interest is in guitars?
Well, I think pretty much all architects, regardless of how stylistically or culturally you're focused as an architect, regardless of whether you're primarily a theorist or primarily a historian, or if you're a building architect who's, built vast urban parks like Bernard Tschumi and the La Villette Park in Paris and all of Bernard's work. No matter what, you're going to be aware of materials, of material connections, of thinking structurally, of thinking compositionally. And guitar design is about material. It's about structural connections. It's about material properties, resonance, thermal properties, glue joints versus non-glue joints, all of these things that architects work with every day and get obsessed with, even if you're not a building architect. Like my wife is a building architect and we've collaborated together and I've worked on projects with her, but I'm mostly not a building architect. But I'm obsessed with the work of people like Michelucci and Carlos Scarpa, who are very materials focused designers and architects. Cecil Baumann, the structural engineer, joined an event that we held in the Limits of Guitar a number of years ago, and we had a great conversation between Cecil and Elliot Sharp. Cecil is an amateur classical guitarist. He's also one of the world's most important structural engineers. Has worked with the world's most important architects on some of the most important projects. And it's really wonderful to see that the scale shift from one, for example, the glue joint on the interior of a Torres guitar, which I remember talking to Florian Verreiter about back in 2013 or 14. Florian had one of the Torres guitars CT scanned. Florian was one of the people leading this, the kind of onslaught of CT scanning of guitars more than a decade ago. And I remember Florian saying, well, he wanted to do it because he wanted to see how the interior of a glue joint had been prepared by Torres, if it had been prepared at all. And the only way you could see inside a glue joint, aside from tearing it apart, was to CT scan it. And so, architects have that same kind of approach and interest. It really matters to an architect, usually, even if they're not a building architect, it really matters to know how stuff fits together. And the attention to detail, like how do you set up wood to meet metal, to meet stone, to meet glass?
Yeah.
And across time, So it's very, very, very important. I think that's why architects are interested in musical instruments often. I've known a lot of architects who are musicians, of course, but that's just my sample. My sample size is a lot of people who I've met who happen to be also musicians.
Sure. Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world, where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive. Those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon at patreon.com/business of guitar. That's patreon.com/business of guitar. And it rings true with my experience because, the types of guitars that I'm talking about would be guitars with interesting joinery, interesting materials. Also, if it's a instrument made with carbon fiber, an instrument, even like an Aristides guitar, which I know you know well. They're acoustic engineered materials that they've developed for specifically structure and the movement of energy for sound. A Teufel birdfish, a Matsuda deconstructed archtop. I mean, these are the guitars. When I look at those, I go, "Oh, I'm going to have conversations with architects on the road." They will identify themselves because when I see them and I see the way they look at it, they're not looking at it the way the other people are looking at it.
Yeah.
And I guess that's gesture. They are standing, they're approaching it, their movements towards it, their movements not towards it, because often they're observing it from a slight distance, but they want to get closer, and they're not looking at the same things that an average guitar player would be looking at when they're observing that instrument. And so, that makes me really wonder if, are there things that architects look at with those guitars and go, why are they doing this? I don't want it to be. I know nobody wants to offend the guitar maker or whatever it's. I'm very curious to know: are there joints and ways we're treating the materials which are maintained and conserved within the guitar industry, maybe for good reason, but that a modern designer who's not trying to recreate or reenact something would look at it and go, I have no idea why they're still doing that or why they're doing that. Does that happen?
It probably does. I've been really fortunate to play the instruments built by some of the luthiers that we invited to our events, and to play instruments that I've encountered, met at your events, Jamie, and through knowing people like Elliott Sharp. I played his 8-string archtop built by Saul Cole, and I played a bunch of other Cole guitars. I bought one of Cole's guitars as a present for a friend of mine who was a very important dear friend and influence on me musically when I was a kid, Adam Whittoff. So I've been lucky to encounter these instruments and think about the way that they solve the design challenges that they perceive, the instruments, the luthiers perceive. Of course, as a designer, I'm constantly thinking, wow, I wonder why this choice was made. I wonder how this could be done. I'm hopefully conscious enough of my own lack of knowledge as a luthier to not jump to conclusions about whether some master.
I don't mean to say that one is right and one is wrong. I just mean that it prompts the question: why are they doing that?
Always. Because
we can learn from each other. That's the reason I love cross-disciplinary discussions. And so maybe you don't want to. Maybe you want to take the risk of saying something that you look at that way. But I mean, certainly someone like Ken Parker. I mean, his whole design is based on him looking at guitars going, why are we doing it like this? Why it would be better if we did it this way. And then him going through the process of experimenting and creating and then doing what he thinks is the more logical solution for that particular joint or way to get the instrument to function. And so,
Well, my encounter with Ken, basically, this is a funny backstory. I'll be brief. One, Ken was an incredibly generous person around the guitar shows that we put together and the events that I ran on Limits of Guitar and Future of Guitar. And, he was just constantly accessible and super friendly. He loaned me one of his prototype guitars that he had built with Fred Copo for a year at one point. He just showed up at my house one day with that guitar and a couple of his archtops, and it was Thanksgiving. He just showed up. He said, I'm driving past. Don't you live there? I'm driving past. I'll stop by. He stopped by and he left this guitar for a year with me. I mean, Ken is a gem of a human, incredible person. But he also is a genius as a builder. And the way I discovered his work, I saw a video once of Adrian Belew playing with King Crimson, playing his Parker Fly. And I thought, damn, I've never seen one of those guitars before. What is Adrian playing? And I filed it away in the back of my mind. And a year or two later, I went to a guitar store out in Connecticut that is no longer there anymore. It closed. I was specifically looking for an Empress, and I'm trying to remember the name of this builder now. It just suddenly slipped out of my mind, but this person built back in the 90s really beautiful small-scale boutique guitars, and one of their models was an Empress. It was kind of like a Les Paul Strat fusion guitar with a neck set in. God darn it, I can't remember this luthier's name. But anyway, so I knew that they had one in this shop, and I went to check it out. And in the shop, they had a Parker Fly, one of the standard 2000 models. It's a mahogany with the older tremolo twist wheel thing, and, that configuration. And I played it through a matchless for 2 hours. They put me in the amp room, and they had a matchless that I'd never played through a matchless. So I played it through the matchless, and at the end of 2 hours, I just said, "Forget it, man! I have to buy this guitar." I had never encountered anything like it, and at the time, I had a Newberg era Steinberger GM4T, which I, like an idiot, I sold after I bought the Parker Fly. I was like, I don't need to have two of these incredibly beautiful guitars because I'm not a professional guitarist. Fortunately, the person I sold it to still uses it to this day, and their son uses it. So I know it's in good hands, and I don't feel bad about losing the Steinberger. But I did have this amazing Steinberger at the time that I sold. But I brought home the Parker Fly, and it just, it continues to this day to blow my mind what a cool guitar it is as a guitar for playing, and it, of course, I didn't know everything about the fabrication when I got it. And I learned much more over the subsequent years. And then I learned more when I finally met Ken and, was lucky enough to talk to him and learn from him. So, the long summary in relationship to Ken is, in hearing conversations and reading a lot of interviews with him, he understands the depth of history going back to things like the lute and a stressed skin approach to like empty construction, a neck which would be hollow or would be filled with basswood to the, in such a way that it's almost effectively a hollow piece of stressed skin tube. And he understands the need for a diversity of material across the instrument. I remember Ken saying to me at one point, because I asked him if he had played any carbon fiber guitars like the composite acoustics guitars or et cetera. And he said, he said, but I'm not so into them because it's kind of like basil, Basil is a great ingredient mixed with other ingredients, but you don't have a basil salad, which is just basil. And I remember we laughed about that, and I thought, yeah, this is true. Of course, you have pesto, but pesto isn't just basil. No, pesto is pine nuts and garlic and olive oil. And other spices in proper, modicum. And so,
although I will confess, when I go past the basil plant, I do pluck off a leaf and stick it in my mouth. But I'd never have a salad. You're right. I'd have a bowl of basil. That's right.
I crush it and I rub it on my fingers, and I love smelling it on my fingers afterward, and so forth.
Yes.
But I think the point there, to loop through Ken is an awareness of that kind of mixing, and the way that mixing then does lead to a gesture. I was so glad that I think Joni was still playing one of her Parker Flies when she played a few years ago, and maybe more recently in other concerts. I think she's still playing it. So I love the idea that there's a certain need in her hands, even when she was younger, for a certain lightness of touch, and that Ken made an instrument which appealed not only to Adrian Belew but also to Joni Mitchell, who I think is one of the most important guitarists also who's ever lived. So anyway, maybe this is an indirect way of approaching what you're talking about. But I also, I've been very happy to hack away at instruments like Ola Strandberg. The first Strandberg guitar I got was an 8-string that was produced by their when they were building them in the States in the Washburn Custom Shop. And it's a really cool guitar, which has a really intense neck on it. But I also, the way that I play, I usually press very hard with my forearm on the upper bout of the instrument. So for me, a Strat, ergonomically, for my right arm right here, a Strat is the best ergonomic. And the Strandberg, of course, is a little bit shorter between the bridge and the upper bout. The upper bout is beveled. So about a year ago, I sat down with the luthier Martin Keith. And Martin, of course, builds incredibly beautiful electric basses. He also builds gorgeous acoustic instruments, both flat top and arch top instruments. And I've been lucky to hang out with Martin. He did a workshop with us at the Limits of Guitar event back in, I think it was 2019. And he's worked on all my guitars. So I've been super lucky to, woodshed ideas with Martin for a number of years now. So I had him build an upper bout extension on my Strandberg 8-string. And we actually went back and forth. He convinced me, he was like, I can do a detail where it'll connect to the strap pin. And I kept saying, but no, we can just drill into the upper bout and we can put some really beautiful brass bushings in here. And he was like, no, Ed, let's not modify the instrument that much. And I was like, but it's a player instrument. I don't care if he said, no, Ed, we really, let's take it step. He convinced me to not, completely drill into this instrument. And so now I have an extension, which extends even a little bit further than a Strat upper bout that my arm rests on. And of course, it doesn't really change the performance of the instrument in any way because it's attached with a larger bolt to the strap pin. But I'm constantly thinking about those kinds of details. Yeah,
I would love to see a picture of that someday, Ed. If you have the thought to do so, to take a picture of it and send it to me, I'd love to see it.
Right here,
right here in the painting. Oh my God, the painting's not real.
Put it in the painting. It should be in the painting.
let's see if the AI and your camera can pick up on the guitar or not, because the bag keeps disappearing. Let's see. Maybe if you put it on your body, maybe it'll stay with us. Yes.
So you see what we did, what Martin and I did, is we added this extension here.
Okay. Yes.
And it's got a much longer pin there.
Yeah.
To hold it in place. And it still has the usual Strandberg ergonomics, the beautiful ergonomics of sitting in a classical position and like this. But it actually changes the balance of the guitar. The Strandbergs have excellent balance, as you know. But this guitar, because it has a Wengy neck, is a super heavy neck. It's an 8-string neck. It's really wide. It's not. It doesn't have bad balance, but it doesn't have perfect balance. And now it has perfect balance, basically, because of the way that the strap has extended this.
Does Ola know about this guitar? Did you show it to him like this?
I didn't show this to him. I need to show it to him, or maybe he's hearing for the first time as he listens to the podcast. So greetings, Ola, and I have to send you a picture of this modification. Yeah. Great.
Love that.
Yeah.
You know, that's it's interesting, the idea that you were like, just add it on, because I'm not precious about guitars in that way either. I would have done just like you, like, just screw in here with a couple of, but I had a couple of very, very well experienced, perhaps some of the top repair guys in the world here in my home last week. Brian Gallup and Joe Glazer were here. And now that we have a place in Tuscany, there were 5 guitar makers here last week alone. Like there's everyone apparently wants a friend in Tuscany. So there's a long list of guitar makers coming to visit. Anyways, one of the stories that came up over dinner was talking about, this habit that people took, and they flattened out 60s Stratocaster fretboards and put in jumbo frets at one point in time, or put in a Keller or a Floyd Rose into a vintage Les Paul or whatever it happened to be, and how sacrilegious that was, and what a big mistake it was. And actually, I hope it's okay to tell this story. I'm going to do it anyways. Joe Glazer told this story about Jerry Reed, the famous country guitar player, an incredible fingerstyle player as well. Lots of footage of Jerry Reed and Chet Atkins playing together, actually. And he told the story of replacing the neck on Jerry's Telecaster with a flatter fretboard neck, because that's what Jerry wanted. So he ordered a afterparts sort of thing and put it on, and then Jerry didn't want the old neck, so he had the neck that Jerry recorded a lot of very famous music on. And then later on, Jerry replaced the pickups or something, and they also came his way through some other bridge, because Joe's kind of the guy in Nashville for all the repairs. And later on, after Jerry had died, someone had said something to him. It came up that says, "Yeah, I've got one of Reed's old bodies." Like, what old body? And he basically Theseus shipped this Reed's guitar back together. Well, the funny thing is, the real story is Joe has unequivocally Theseus shipped. The question is, whatever guitar Reed was playing, was that still the guitar that he had parted everything out in over time? But there's this real sort of idea of the sacred about it. And so right now, people are going to get tired of me talking about this thing in Tuscany. I'm so enamored with this, Right now, I'm in a 15th century building. Like, I don't know how old these stones are.
Yeah.
But the beams above me are the classic big Tuscan beams. Yeah. And if this building was made in the 15th century, then presumably the trees are, 13th century or more, because they didn't, it's substantial. And at first we were thinking about, how do we hang things and put in lighting and curtains and all the things you normally do when you move into a house. And at first we were very precious about these old beams. But as I'm looking at them, I'm going, those are modern staples. That's a really old nail. That was a handmade nail, and then you sort of look through it all and you realize every building around here has these. They're not precious at all to these people. Like, this is just normal. They're everywhere. All of this stuff. And I wandered down the street, and there was a church that was open. Roberta and I walked in, and there was a QR code there with the Uffizi's name on it. The paintings in the church are done by Raphael. It's not a well-known, significant church. It's just the church we were walking by to get the rental car. You know, and there's this idea of what is sacred, what is not sacred, the same object, two different people, you know, and so Martin's, to sort of thread this finally, you know, Martin's response to your Strandberg, I suspect, has a great deal to do with, no. One day this may be regarded like a 57 Stratocaster, and someone is going to be, what the hell did you do by drilling holes into this?
He was definitely keeping me on track. You know, that guitar I think was built and assembled in part by the wonderful guitarist and builder Alan Marcus, who worked really closely with Ola Strandberg at the beginning of Strandberg. Alan was the one who came out in the Future Guitar series and played the Strandbergs for us when Ola did his talk back in 2013. You know, he's a great guitarist, Alan is. So yeah, I hear exactly what you're saying. On the other hand, you know, I try to be judicious about how I do this. That guitar I wasn't feeling too anxious about. I just wasn't feeling too anxious about it. But there are a few other guitars I have where I wouldn't do that. I just simply wouldn't do it. Although the very first acoustic guitar I have was given to me by my father. It's an Aria classical. It was built in the early 70s. And it's a nice classical. It's just nothing special. I mean, it's probably worth like $400 on Reverb right now. Actually less because of what I just did to it with Martin Keith. So but this guitar, I played on some of my undergraduate music performance concerts in like 1982. And I learned to play Leo Brouwer on it. My dad was given this guitar, or it was chosen for him by Jim Hall. And my dad was working as a technical director on television shows in New York City in the 60s.
Jim Hall's a famous jazz guitar player, for those of you listening who don't know. Very notable.
He had met Jim, and and he had asked Jim to choose a classical guitar for him on 48th Street. So I guess they walked over together on 48th Street, and Jim chose the Aria, which probably was very cheap, but it's a nice, you know, for a cheap classical guitar, it's quite nice. Anyway, I hitchhiked around the country with this guitar wrapped in a green army blanket. This guitar has survived so many potential disasters unscathed. And so last year I took it to Martin Keith, and I said, Martin, you know, one thing I was thinking about with this guitar, I just want to refret it, but I was thinking, why don't we put a little bit of a radius on the fretboard? And why don't we do a partial cutaway on it? Because I was thinking of a project that Martin would enjoy doing, you know, outside of building his own amazing electric basses and acoustics. And so we did. We refretted it, and in the process of refretting it, we radiused the fingerboard with, I think, like a 16-inch radius, and we put a small cutaway on it. Now it plays a little bit different. We didn't clean up any of the small dings on the neck or anything like that. And I'm enjoying playing it right now. I have tomastic strings on it, so it plays not at all like a nylon string. It's something different. It's very different. So I like that kind of process of the instrument evolving. Of course, there are musicians like Steve Vai, who he's probably got to have, you know, a few hundred guitars, and when he's on tour, he's probably got to have 24, all of which are going through rotations and being repaired on a daily basis, and parts hybridized off of them and cannibalized and so forth. You know, so I'm sure he has guitars that he would never change anything on, but I would imagine his approach to the instrument is very much a pragmatic one when he's out on tour.
I don't know that that's true, because Thomas Nordic, right? Nordic, Steve's tech is Austrian. He's quite close with Michael Spalt, and Michael Spalt has been brought many of Steve's guitars to hack away and knock away. Does a wonderful job, don't get me wrong, but to basically wood butcher it, to put in a Sustainiac or to put in something else and to do these things. Now, there's probably certain guitars he doesn't do that with, of course, but I think he's still quite experimental, and I think that he's allows certain exploration anyways. Thomas is extremely experimental as a guitar tech. Thomas is one of those guys that is regularly talked about within the industry, that he comes by at the NAMM show and he's got this little thing he wants to show you because he found this, isn't this really cool, and he wants to introduce you to the other person because this is a great invention and it can do this, this, and this. I mean, very innovative, early adopter. He's not precious about the historic pieces at all.
He's been on tour with Steve and Adrian on this tour. I mean, I know he was there at Beacon because I saw him wandering out on stage during the tour, during the
remarkable
before the set and in between sets. So
gotta be like 80.
Definitely there.
But the fact that he's still on the road is remarkable, actually, because he's not a spring chicken.
He's got to be having a lot of fun, man.
Oh, I think so too. So, anyways, Ed, this has been really enjoyable, and I know that you and I can talk and have talked for much, much longer. But I think it's a lovely spot to sort of wrap up the current segment before we move on. We'll do a little segment called the business of guitar. And although you're not in the guitar business specifically, you're still a creative who is in business. And so I would like to, we'll head over, for those of you who follow us on the business of guitar, over to our Patreon shortly for that. For those of you who don't know about it and want to hear what Ed has to say, you can go to patreon.com/the business of guitar, and you'll hear us talk for another 5 to 15 minutes there on being a creative who has to sustain themselves, because our creative activities, well, take money and time. And so we'll talk about those things over there. Ed, as we wrap up here, I always like to give the last word to our guests. If I were a better interviewer, would there have been something I should have asked you that you were hoping to talk about today that we can cover here? Or?
Oh, come on. It was great. And I think I covered a lot of territory. I probably went very far afield for some of the listeners, but hopefully you stuck around and you caught the linking everything together a few times there between the gesture focus, dabbling in generative artificial intelligence, cultural history, why people can listen to Tool and enjoy it on a popular level, all of that. So I think we covered an enormous amount of territory.
All right,
I think we touched on everything I wanted to, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Ed, for being on Life with Strings Attached. I always enjoy our conversations. Incredibly inspiring, always talking with you, and I look forward to the next time.
Thanks, Jamie. Feeling is mutual. Thank you so much.
Bye for now. Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts, and a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.